Ladies and gentlemen, after 103 hours, I have finally finished Metaphor ReFantazio. And while for the most part I enjoyed the gameplay, outside of a couple nitpicks that I'll obviously talk about, I have some thoughts about the story to say the least. And I feel like people's standards for storytelling in JRPGs must be at an all-time low if this is being awarded Best Narrative, along with receiving mass praise online for its story, even though I mostly found it pretentious as it tries to tackle multiple serious subjects without really saying much about them at all, such as racism, social hierarchies, and multiple different economic systems, along with having an extremely one-dimensional cast of characters that can all be basically boiled down to a sentence or less throughout an entire 80-hour plus game. So I hope you guys are ready to journey alongside Floydicus II as he sets out on an adventure to defeat Great Value Griffith to attain the cure for the fentanyl curse that his childhood friend the Prince obtained after buying some dirty rocks from the local Magla station. But do not fear, because our main man Floydicus not just has the power of domestic abuse on his side, but he also has his newly awakened power known as an archetype.
George Floyd Online, connecting to new graphic interface. Pregnant women detected. Target eliminated.
So I'll start with the gameplay first, since that's the part of the game that I personally enjoyed the most. And I feel like the best Atlas game to compare the combat to would probably be the Shin Megami series, specifically Shin Megami 5. And speaking of that game, if you thought the protagonist of Shin Megami 5 looked like a femboy, wait till you get a load of this guy. Nice Alice band, you wear that to keep the hair out of your face when you're sucking cock? So Metaphor features a turn-based combat system, but it has a couple unique gimmicks to keep it feeling unique from other games in the genre. For starters, you might notice that in the top left corner of your screen, you'll see these diamond-like figures. And what these diamonds represent is basically the amount of turns you have left in your attack phase. And you can gain an extra turn by landing an attack that your opponent is weak to, which could be either a specific element or a certain type of attack, like a slash or a blunt force hit. You can also gain an extra turn by landing a critical hit, but of course this is a bit less consistent than attacking the enemy's weakness. On the other hand, you can also lose a turn if you attack with an element that the enemy is immune to, or if the opponent dodges your attack, which can really cause the tide of battle to change really quickly if your opponent starts attacking with something that one of your characters is weak to. And I think it's probably pretty important to mention here that I personally played the game on hard, and it was actually completely by accident because I'm a champion. So my personal experience for the gameplay section in this review will be coming from the hard difficulty, which was definitely a welcome challenge, but I'm not gonna lie and say there weren't a couple of moments where I was getting pretty fucking heated on a couple of the bosses in particular. Another thing I enjoyed about the combat system that also adds an extra layer of strategy is that instead of just having all four of your characters lined up side by side, there are actually two rows on the combat field, the back row and the front row, which you can freely switch between on each of your characters' turns. And by being in the front row, you get more attack, but you take more damage, and by being in the back row, you do less damage, but you take less damage. And this is crucial to manage, especially on hard mode, where the bosses can dish out some disgusting damage if you're not paying attention at basically all times.
You are a worthless, bitch-ass nigga. You should kill yourself now.
Your party also has access to a set of abilities called synthesis skills, and these are pretty much just combo attacks that you can do between multiple members of your party, usually anywhere from 2 to 3, but most of them are 2 different members. and the combo skills that you have access to will vary depending on the archetypes that your different party members have equipped at the time. And the catch with these is that these abilities will obviously be stronger than your individual abilities, but they can also cost anywhere from 2 to 3 of your turns, so sometimes it'll really require you to sit there and think for a sec, because you'll have to decide, fuck, do I want to do a lot of damage to the boss this round, or do I want to buff my team and maybe heal a little bit? And they're huge game changers to the combat overall, and personally I wound up using them almost just as much as individual abilities, especially by the end of the game, where you can find accessories that reduce the cost of the turns they require. So like I said before, if there is one thing I have to give this game props for, it's definitely its combat system, and it was the most enjoyable out of any Atlas game I've played so far. So in this game, instead of going around and catching personas like their Pokemon and evolving them into stronger personas, you have a more traditional kind of, I guess you could kind of call it a skill tree. And as you play through the game and meet new characters, you'll unlock new archetypes, which all specialize in different things. Like for example, there's a mage, which is mostly used for learning new magic spells. There's the warrior, which is basically just a pure damage unit. There's of course a healer, there's a knight, which acts as a tank, but you get the point. There are plenty of different archetypes to choose from, and each of them are used for something completely different. And another thing that's good about this system is that unlike the Persona games, every single party member you acquire has an archetype skill tree, giving you full customization over your entire party as opposed to just the main character like in Persona. And of course in a JRPG, that's a welcome change. And funnily enough, the archetype system is a little comparable to the last game I reviewed, the Dragon Quest III remake, in that you get almost full customization over your party, because whenever you level into an archetype and you gain a new ability, you can then transfer anywhere from 1 to 4 of those abilities to a different archetype depending on what level your social link is with said character that archetype is linked to. And by doing this, you get high levels of customization over your team, as you can level multiple people into multiple different classes, having them specialized in 2 to 3 different things throughout the course of the game, as opposed to just being locked into one said job the entire time. Although I do have one complaint regarding this system, and that's that this entire customization system is made a bit more redundant, because towards the end of the game you'll gain access to something called a royal archetype, and each character has their own royal archetype, but to unlock this you have to have leveled specific archetypes to their max level before you can unlock the royal archetype. So if you spent the entire game leveling up an archetype that isn't related to the royal archetype, then you either have to grind your ass off in the final portion of the game, or you're basically just shit out of luck. Which is why I personally don't understand why, like in most games, this skill tree, there isn't a way to reset your skill tree and get all your XP back that you spent for a situation exactly like this. It definitely seems like an oversight, but on the plus side, the final dungeon has plenty of places to grind levels. Luckily though, I had no problems unlocking every archetype for every character, given that I did all the side content and grinded whenever I needed to. So overall, I definitely have to say that the archetype is an improvement on the Persona system, and I personally enjoyed the extra freedom that it gives you. If I were to have one complaint for sure about the combat system though, especially on hard mode, it would have to be the sheer RNG at certain times. And by sheer RNG, I mean things mostly out of your control, like the boss just randomly dodging one of your attacks, or every single one of your party members getting inflicted by a status effect at the same time, one of your characters just missing an attack, or the boss seemingly getting a fucking critical attack every other goddamn turn!
That's right. You're not dealing with the average Saiyan warrior anymore. You black spear chucker piece of shit, nigger!
If you remember what I said before, basically every single one of these things results in the boss then getting a nether turn, and I cannot describe to you how fucking rage-inducing it is to be about 15 minutes deep in a hard boss fight, only for one of my characters to then miss a fucking attack, or for the boss to then get 3 criticals in the row and wipe my entire party, forcing me to then restart the entire fight. And to make things even worse, there is a fucking anxiety status effect. And I'll definitely be talking a little more about this later as it does play into the game's main plot. And it seemed like the anxiety status effect would sometimes just randomly happen after one of my characters missed an attack, had an attack reflected, blocked, or even sometimes just from having one of their weaknesses hit, which at that point just felt like a spit on the face, considering that losing 2 of my turns was already a bad enough punishment as it was, and could already potentially cost me the entire fight. But somehow in a world with magically induced healing and giant flying boats with mech legs called gauntlet runners, these fucking retards still haven't invented the Prozac.
Look out, faggot!
And one last thing related to the combat, and definitely and probably one of the biggest pros I can give to the game, is the enemy and boss designs, as they are some of the most creative and non-generic enemy types I have seen in quite a while in a AAA game. And my first thought when seeing some of these bosses is that I was fist fighting a fucking Van Gogh painting. But upon doing a little bit of research, apparently all the enemy and boss designs are based off of an artist called Hieronymus Bosch. And after looking into some of his work, the enemy designs are near identical. So whether they were completely original designs or not, I don't really care because they still look pretty damn cool in game. And I'm at least happy to not be fighting the same generic enemy type for hours on end. One thing I definitely want to talk about in regards to the gameplay, as it's something that Atlus is usually pretty good with, are the dungeon designs, and especially the side quest dungeons. As someone that's played Persona 3, 4, and 5, if there's one thing I have to give props to Persona 5 for, it's the design of each of the palaces, or dungeons, because I found myself looking forward to each palace in that game to see what the main theme was, as they were all visual eye candy and had great and unique designs that I loved exploring and finding new loot throughout. And that is something that I found Metaphor to be severely lacking on, as not just was every dungeon basically some variation of a castle or a tomb, but they all felt almost the exact same in their layout, in that they were all basically just long hallways with random rooms off to the side and a separate path here and there for you to go off to explore for loot. And barely any of the dungeons actually had some unique gimmick outside of a couple towards almost the end of the game. And while the combat definitely made the dungeons more enjoyable, I never found myself in awe at pretty much any of the designs at damn near any point in the game. And this problem is highlighted even more in the side quest dungeons, which I swear to God are basically all some variation of a reskinned cave or a tower. And while I still did every bounty hunt and side quest in the game, it felt like an absolute fucking slog to get through, because it just felt like I was seeing the same shit over and over and over again with only slight variations. And if it wasn't for the decent loot, I probably wouldn't have done them at all. I can say that I at least like how the layout of the side quests work, and that they're pretty much all linked to the plot of the main story in some way, and they flow naturally with the main course of the story. But in terms of the actual level design, you'll go from a cave to a slightly darker cave to a cave with lava. Wow, holy fucking shit. Now we're talking variety. So the last two things I feel worth mentioning in the gameplay section before I get into the story and the characters would probably be the calendar system and the social links, which if you've played an Atlus game before, you already know what I'm talking about. But if not, the way Atlus games work is they essentially follow a calendar like in the real world, where you have to kind of make every day count in a way, because the way the main story works is that they'll give you a main objective and then they'll give you a time limit, which is just a certain amount of days that you have to complete that objective, and if not, it's pretty much a game over. But I can assure you that as long as you're not fucking half asleep at the keyboard, you have ample time to complete all the objectives, so it's really not something to stress about. But the way each day works is that you can do a task during the day, which after completing that, it'll then become nighttime, where you can do another task, and some tasks are only available during daytime, and some tasks are only available during nighttime. And personally, I enjoy enjoy this system in the Persona games. But with that being said, I think it also fits well into the Persona games, given that you're basically a high school student following a school schedule. Plus the games take place in real world settings, which I'd argue that by adding a calendar kind of makes into a more interactive experience, I guess you could say. But my main point is, I think the calendar system works good in the Persona games, but I feel like it's completely unnecessary in this game, because ultimately it adds nothing. I feel like Metaphor would have been way better off just playing like a more standard JRPG, where you're free to roam the world at your own pace and complete tasks at your own discretion, because I found the calendar system to basically just be an arbitrary time limit for the sake of having a time limit, and to basically just have another mechanic from the Persona games. If you've played it, I'd love to hear your opinion on this and what you feel like it adds to the game, because personally I would have much preferred if they just did away with the calendar system altogether and treated this new franchise a bit differently, especially since in some of the later portions of the game you can complete the main task within like a day or two, which just leaves you with several days with your thumb up your ass if you've already completed your social links or anything else you need to do in the meantime. Which that leads me into the social links. And if you don't know what the social links are, basically the way Atlus games work is that whenever you gain a new party member or you meet a plot important character, the MC will then form a bond with them, and you can then raise that bond level by spending time with said character, which will grant you extra benefits within the game depending on whatever that character does. Like for example, one of the characters might give you money, one of the characters might give you bonuses in battle. You get the point. I will say right off the bat that I think they handled the social links better in this game than in the Persona games, as I found some of the social links to just be really fucking annoying in Persona, and it can sometimes be really difficult to max them all if you're not following a guide down to like the perfect timing for every day, as some of the characters' social links are limited to certain days, and some of the characters' social links can overlap on the same day, which can then cause you to stress and worry about having to catch it on another day. Whereas in this, I found the social links pretty much just always available when I needed them to, and I had no problem maxing every single one by the end of the game, which I was almost never able to do on a first playthrough of any of the Persona games. So while I definitely think the functionality of the social link system is better, I do have one complaint, because it really does make no fucking sense, and it makes me bat an eye at Atlus a little bit. But in Persona, one of the main things related to the social links is also the romance system, as you need the max rank to romance said character. But for some reason, Metaphor, Atlus's first game that features almost entirely adults and young adults outside of the Shin Megami franchise, doesn't have romance. And I'm not gonna lie, for a minute I thought maybe there was no romance because the main character canonically starts fucking the prince in the ass at some point later in the game, but that is not the case. The character has no canonical romance, and considering that one of the main themes of the story is becoming king, you would also think that finding a queen is kind of pivotal to your role. So I gotta ask you, Atlus, why does the one game that doesn't feature almost entirely high schoolers, the one game that doesn't have romance? What did you mean by this? What's gotten into you, Atlus? Something I want to quickly mention, because I'm not even sure if it was entirely intentional or not, considering that this was made by Japanese devs and not American ones. But in regards to the social links, sometimes you have to raise something called a royal virtue to unlock the next step in the social link. And these are the same thing as like your different personality traits and persona that you raised by doing different activities. But one of the 5 royal virtues is a tolerance stat.
Riddle me this. I am loud and obnoxious. I like music that rhymes. I'm a fraction of the population, but I commit half the crimes. Who am I? The answer is, who is the...
Yes, you should love yourself now. Yes, you should. Because I do.
Which is basically meant to represent your acceptance and your open-mindedness towards other cultures in the game. And funnily enough, you know how you raise this tolerance stat? By dragging your white ass over to one of the brown islanders to learn about their culture. And even more funny, this is the same culture that also practices human sacrifice. Thank you, Jeet, for teaching me how to offer up my firstborn to the blue man. So now that I've ran my mouth about the gameplay for almost 20 minutes, and I've probably lost over half my viewers, it's time to get into the part I've been dreading the most, and that's the story and characters. In regards to the characters and the story, it would probably be best for me to start with the characters first, since I feel like the character writing does a pretty good job of highlighting my issues with the rest of the story, and that main issue comes down to two main complaints. A lack of nuance, and by that I mean both the characters and the stories do nothing but repeat the same thing 50 million goddamn times throughout the entire course of the story, and two, an absolutely surface level approach at absolutely every single topic the game tries to touch on. And even though there were two characters I actually did really like and we'll talk a bit more about, I will now describe to you every party member in the game in 2 sentences or less, except for Bastilio, who I'll talk a bit more about, as I found Bastilio's writing to be a step above every other party member in the game. Stroll wants revenge on Luis for the destruction of his family's town, and his goal is to rebuild. Hulkenberg, an assless elf who loves any disgusting dish you put in front of her and is upset that she failed the prince. And on a side note, I know I've mentioned she has no ass, but just to be clear, this isn't even a gooner, oh her ass is too small type of thing. No, I mean that Hulkenberg has no ass. She has Hank Hill cheeks. When she sits down, it's straight pelvis to chair. Heismay. This is one of the characters I actually did like and I will talk a bit more about, but Heismay is basically grieving the death of his bat son after he was beat to death in the mean streets of Chicago. Up next is Juna, and she's probably the worst one of them all, but her entire character is basically, I've worn a mask my entire life, and now I get to find my own purpose and live for myself. Yufa, a native islander chick who, much like Juna, has to find a new purpose in life after her previous purpose of being used as a human sacrifice didn't quite plan out. And Galaga. Even though she's not a party member, she is with you the entire game, as she's kind of the Morgana of Metaphor, but holy shit, did I just want to grab this bitch by the throat and shove her in a mailbox by the halfway point. For starters, Galaga has almost no fucking character. The entire purpose of her character is to remind your character of the main objective, agree with him, and ultimately she kinda has, I guess, a minor character arc where she decides that she wants to help free people of their anxieties. Become a therapist, bitch. And in combat in particular, she could not be more goddamn annoying. Your character could get shot in the face, point blank by a shotgun, and she'd come over to you and whisper in your ear, "Damn, that looks pretty bad. Have you tried healing?"
Now that's a lot of damage!
Or your entire party will get infected with a status effect, and she'll be like, "Damn, in case you didn't already know, your entire party just got hepatitis C." And every trait you just heard me use to describe each character is pretty much the extent of their character growth throughout the entire game, outside of a bit more depth, which you'll find in their character links. But even the social links I found myself less interested in doing, even though I did, for the sake of the review, because I never found myself that interested in any of the characters. And in addition to that, throughout this entire 100-hour game, there's basically zero tension between any of your party members, everybody gets along at all times, everybody agrees on everything, and you can easily see everything happen 3 steps before it actually does because of how predictable all the writing is. And I feel like the only way you'll find yourself super invested into any of these characters is if you happen to find yourself relating really hard to that one character trait or one experience the character went through that defines their entire life. It's like if when you were in the 5th grade, some dickhead named Jacob stole your red crayon and you decided to allow that one experience to reshape your entire life and not talk about anything other than that one experience, and how that one experience with the theft of your special crayon defined you from that point forward. From the first time you meet the character till the credits roll, the only development anybody in your party will have is essentially just getting over that one hurdle in their life and nothing else. And to kind of help describe what I mean better, I'll talk about why I did like Heismay and why I did like Bastilio, while avoiding any major spoilers, because I feel like these two have character writing a step above everybody else in the game. So Heismay Hazume's overall character arc is that he abandoned everything he knew to go live in a cave after his son was pretty brutally beat to death on the streets. And he has a really hard time coming to terms with this, and when you first meet him, he's almost lost all will to live and doesn't really know where to continue in life at this point, until after meeting you, your part, and going through his overall character arc. And during his side missions, Hazume is looking for a place to bury his son's remains, and is having an overall hard time deciding where to do it, given the nature of his people, as he says. And while doing this, you return to his old village, you get a look into his people's ways, their culture, their general mindset towards society, and how they go about things. And Hazume is, let's just say, he's ultimately met with rejection from his people, without going into spoilers. The way that he feels like a grieving father coming to terms with his son's death feels extremely well written and natural, which is a lot more than I can say for the majority of the writing in this game. And it was also interesting getting a look into one of the different tribes in this game, since I'll talk about later, that is one thing this game is extremely lacking on, in my opinion, for how much emphasis it has on the story. And from the beginning of the game to the end of the game, Hazume's character progression feels overall well written, and one of the only characters in your party that tend to offer a different way of looking at things or approaching a situation. And his social link quest are one of the only quests in the game that generally had me feeling something other than just, okay, I guess. And then we have Bastillo or Bastilio. I'm honestly not sure which one it is, but I wound up just calling him Bastillo most of the time. And he is, in my opinion, the best character in the game, which is why I also think it's a shame that he's the last character that you acquire. But for a large part of the game, Bastillo is more of an antagonistic figure, as he's working directly under Luis, the main villain of the game. And while avoiding any major spoilers, there's a significant portion of the game where you work alongside him, and throughout the game, you get a good look at Bastillo's thought process and maturity, as he finds a new way to look at things. And much like Hazume, Bastillo is also grieving the death of somebody close to him when he first joins your party, and it's definitely interesting seeing two characters approach death differently, and both come to terms with it in their own ways. Bastillo also has one of the coolest scenes in the entire game.
It doesn't matter to you. Killing anyone, it doesn't make you feel unclean. You're the kind of cold-blooded bastards we hate more than anything!
It's kind of hard to explain without having you experience it yourself, but it just feels like two different levels of writing. It feels like Hazume and Bastillo almost feel like they were written for a more adult audience, where the other characters almost feel like they were written for autistic people who have a hard time understanding basic human emotions and need everything constantly repeated to them to follow how each character's feeling. And at a certain point, that just begins to grind on you after such a long game. To put that in perspective, I'll quickly describe Hulkenberg's social link a little bit. And like I mentioned before, one of the only two big part of Hulkenberg's character arc is her feeling like she fell as a knight to protect the prince. And during her social arc, while she's going through this thought process, you're in the middle of talking to her, and she begins to describe another knight that she was also childhood friends with, that she says that she strives to be like, was a great example of a knight. And as she literally says, I wonder what he's up to now, the camera pans to her childhood friend publicly executing a minority for some minute reason out of the absolute blue, as if to be any more blunt to tell you, this guy has changed since you last saw him, he is now an absolute piece of shit, with absolute zero subtlety or nuance whatsoever. And a big part of this character arc is basically just to tell Hulkenberg, you're not a failure, this guy's an actual failure, you shouldn't feel bad about what happened to the prince, because you're still a good person at heart, unlike this guy. And the other knight's whole reason for being such a piece of shit now is essentially jealousy, as he's upset because he feels like he's had to work 6 times harder to get where he's at as compared to Hulkenberg due to her name alone, as if that gives you an excuse to just start publicly executing people over stupid random bullshit. And that type of writing is just consistent throughout the entire story. And like I'll talk about later, especially in the spoiler section, is what also just flat out ruined the main villain for me, because the writing in this game could not be any more black and white. So the general premise of the story is that in the very opening cutscene of the game, the king is killed by Luis, which then, because of the king's magic, sets in place what's essentially a magic tournament. And the point of this tournament is to pretty much decide who will become the next king. And the person who will become the next king is ultimately decided by what's essentially a popularity vote. Whoever has the majority of the people's favor. And because of the king's magic, you also can't just openly murder other contestants, which I'm sure a lot of people are instantly like, well, why don't you just start killing everybody? And well, that's why. It's because you can't. If you try to kill another contestant, you're basically immediately hung in the air and struck down by evil wizard shit. And the rightful ruler of the throne, who's the prince, has a curse on him, which the party thinks is because of Luis. And this curse essentially just keeps him in a faint coma where he's in a permanent state of slumber. Protag's main goal is to free the prince of his curse, and because they think that Luis is the wielder of said curse, you join the tournament so that you can ultimately get close to him and kill him. And I was honestly kind of enjoying the story for the first half of the game, as the whole tournament aspect of it was pretty intriguing to me, along with an assassination on another big figure. And while the writing wasn't anything super special, it was at least enough to keep me going. Until about the halfway point in the story, which I'll talk more about this in the spoilers section, get to the point of actually trying to go through with the assassination. I feel like the writing just takes a fucking shit along with the general premise of the story, as the writing goes from a generally well put together plot with overall pretty decent pacing to a Deus Ex Machina padding filled load of horse shit for the remaining 50 to 25% of the game. The entire tournament aspect of the game is essentially thrown out the window. Characters begin to refuse staying dead. The story kind of veers off its clean-cut path to hit you with plot twist after plot twist after plot twist, all of which you could see coming a mile away. And that's another thing. I don't understand how people are trying to suck off the writing of this game so hard when every plot twist was so fucking obvious except for one, which again I'll talk about in the spoilers section because it revolves that halfway point in the story. And the only reason I didn't see that plot twist coming is because it had no build up and came out of thin fucking air. I feel like most of the people who have seen calling this the greatest JRPG of all time have either played very little JRPGs or their standards for writing is just non-existent. There was not a single point in the story where I went, holy shit, I didn't see that coming, that's pretty damn good, because everything was extremely obvious and notioned towards in advance. Especially when the name of the game is Metaphor ReFantazio, it's gonna make your in-game metaphors pretty obvious, especially the point with humans are the real monsters, hint hint wink wink. The second I saw the very first human in game, I knew where this was going. And then when the big plot twist came in the final 80% of the game, I was like, wow, no way. And trust me when I say I am not some huge writing snob. I mean, for example, I love the Dragon Quest III remake, even though that game's plot is extremely bare bones, just because it was a well enough put together game with a solid enough plot to keep me going. And a lot of the time, I don't see other plot twists that people claim to be obvious, simply because I'm not trying really hard to look for them. So that should just highlight to you how obvious the plot twist in the game, when someone who wasn't even really looking for them saw basically every single one coming. I don't get, I genuinely do not get the praise for this story. And a big message of this game's story is anxiety. And the main premise of the story is that you shouldn't keep running away from your anxieties. Instead, you should, overcome them. And in return, it'll make you a stronger person. And while I can't necessarily say that's a bad message, because, I mean, at the end of the day, anxiety is an emotion that every human being experiences. My main problem with it comes down to, just like the character writing, how hard the story beats you over the head with it. It feels like every character, every other sentence is something about anxiety. Nightmare. The writing in this game just has no nuance. Like, it feels like the writers are just standing behind you with a big fucking club beating you over the goddamn head with it. When I first started playing this game, I was streaming it, and I was initially gonna do a drinking game, and one of my plans was to take a shot every time I heard mention of anxiety. Thank God I didn't do that. I'd be fucking dead. Galaga alone would have killed me with how much that word comes out of her goddamn mouth. And again, I am not against the message of overcoming your fears or overcoming your anxieties to become a emotionally stronger person instead of just crumbling, but you can do these things without repeating yourself a million times. And while I'm on the topic of anxiety, this kind of leads me into my problem with Luis. I felt like Luis was a good enough villain, and I honestly kind of enjoyed him for like the first half of the game, like I said with the plot, and I especially liked the way that instead of just being all pissy and I'm evil, he more or less had a different viewpoint from the protagonist, and argued with multiple of the party members, kind of just using facts and reasoning to shut them up, and there's a couple points in the story where our party isn't even really able to argue against him, and because of this it makes him an overall intriguing character. And I'd say this works pretty well until around the second half of the game, when Luis abandons all nuance and any chance of redeeming qualities, when, again, without really spoiling anything right now, when all of a sudden he becomes a typical persona in the world type villain, and essentially becomes the equivalent of Senator Armstrong from Metal Gear Rising.
Do I offend you? Are you repulsed? Surely it helps you realize that you can protect nothing without power. The natural blessings you enjoyed are not infinite. Few have the luxury of living with no need to struggle and harm just to survive. But our nation would have you believe such hardship is born of moral weakness. So the punished are punished further. They die in silence like livestock. Their reality denied. It defies reason. All people deserve the chance to fight for their lives with their lives. Some will fall, some will triumph, and therein is true equality forged, however cruel.
That one day, every person in this nation will control their own destiny. A land of the truly free, damn it. A nation of action, not words, ruled by strength, not committee. Where the law changes to suit the individual, not the other way around. Where power and justice are back where they belong. In the hands of the people!
And I would argue that even Sinister Armstrong has a better endgame in mind, which is ironic considering that that game is supposed to be extremely over the top in basically every aspect. And they essentially both have the same ideology of the strong will take what they want from the weak, and the strong will rebuild the new world, except one is slightly less retarded than the other, which is why personally I think, and some people might disagree, instead of this game having some ultimate villain, I feel like Luis should have just been an antagonist, because the definition of an antagonist isn't somebody who's evil or a villain, it's simply somebody that goes against the protagonist. I feel like Luis would have been a way more interesting character, especially in a game that's heavy on politics and all about becoming a king, if Luis was merely a political opponent who had a completely different ideology than the main character, who you ultimately had to defeat in the end simply because there can be one king. Not because you hate the guy, not because he's evil, but because it's either you or him. And I don't see why this couldn't have worked with a more Game of Thrones style story, instead of just throwing all that intrigue and interest out the window to make him a fucking Final Fantasy, I'm gonna end the world type villain. Because you took a character I did find a little interesting and just took a shit on him. And then on another side note, you probably shouldn't have the main party beat his ass like 4 different times, because that takes away any fear that this character might induce. Because every time you beat him and then you fight him again, you're like, oh, okay, well, this dude's kind of a chump. And by the end of the game, he almost feels like fucking Team Rocket blasting off again, trying to run away every time you beat him. The last 2 things I really have to talk about now is this game's takes on racism and social structures. And I just want to say that for a game so heavy on racism, it's funny how little this game has to say about it and its overall approach to racism in the first place. Racism in this game is essentially boiled down to what you could pretty much call stereotypes for each tribe, which other tribes will then use to insult each other throughout the entire game. And what I mean by this is one tribe might be like, oh, your ears are too pointy. And another tribe is, oh, you're notorious to steal, so I'm not gonna let you in my store. While a third tribe might be, you're rich and control all the banks. What did Atlas mean by this? And really never gets any more depth than that. I still, after finishing this game, don't really know why all the tribes actually fucking hate each other to begin with. Well, like I mentioned before, a couple of the social links tell you a couple more details about a couple of the tribes that the main story doesn't really go into. Like, for example, Heisme and the Bat People, they don't tend to get along with other tribes because they're a nocturnal race. So basically, whenever you're asleep, these people are always awake, and while they're asleep, you're all awake. And because of that, there's a lot of distrust among each other since they basically never see each other. And I found that kind of interesting because I'm like, well, yeah, that would make sense, right? Or with Juna's tribe, their real form is basically that resembles a tiny child. So because of that, they constantly use what's basically a magic transformation to take an adult form. And the reason for this is because they know damn well that if they appear as children to everybody, nobody's gonna take them serious as a tribe. But beyond a couple things like that, there is very little depth to the tribes whatsoever. This world is so fucking racist that it makes pre-civil rights America look like a safe haven. In one of the main cities, it's so fucking comical. It's like every other street you turn down, someone's being called a racial slur.
Oh, fucking righteous fucking nigger!
What's wrong with you, you fucking faggot, you cocksucker?
Crowd on this street.
What a fucking nigger.
And if I had to guess why this game had such a surface level approach to things like racism and discrimination, I would have to take a wild guess and say probably because the writers don't have the balls to touch upon things like religious differences, cultural differences, personal experiences, or crime statistics. At most touches a bit upon cultural differences, like I said, in a couple of the social link quests with, again, not much depth even there, with the religious differences basically being as simple as, of course, the equivalent to the Christian church, the Sanctus Church, is controlled by evil people who rewrite history and cover up the truth because, of course, the native people know more of the real history. I've kind of been seeing a lot of people call this a commie game or commie propaganda, and I sure as hell don't know if I'd go as far as to call it propaganda, because I don't think the game has near as strong of a message to be labeled as such. Not to mention, I wouldn't say the game pushes commie ideology, because if anything, this game kind of bashes on every social structure without really saying that anyone in particular is actually right. Like, for example, the closest thing you could probably call a communist insert in this game would be Catherine, who's a Prabrika, which is essentially a tribe of rabbit people, and her whole ideology once she becomes queen would be to take from the rich to equally distribute among everybody, and everybody would share things, and communism basically, more or less. It's the closest they really get to it in this game. But the game openly, multiple times, basically says, no, you're a fucking idiot, and that would never work. You need to rethink everything you're doing. So the game certainly doesn't praise her ideology, and the closest thing to capitalism in this game would have to be all the rich tribes hoarding the money, therefore having the majority of the wealth and owning the majority of the property. But again, the game openly shits on this by making these people seem like fucking assholes. And every time your party ever gets a large amount of money outside a side quest, the main character is always essentially like, no, we should give this back to the people.
Where's the money, Lebowski? Where's the money, Lebowski? Where's the fucking money, shithead?
Now going into this, I thought the game was going to be pro-socialism, especially since the protagonist carries around a book that he shills to every party member at least once, like it's the hottest thing since Anne Frank's diary. And this book is essentially about a socialist utopia where everybody's equal, there's no racism, there's no hierarchies, everybody's free to pursue whatever they want to be. And I'd say the reason it's pro-socialism is because because there's blatant lines in it, such as your worth in society will be the equivalent of how much you provide, and that everything will be owned and shared by the people, and things of that nature. And for the most part, the game pushes it like this is the pro thing, but at a certain part in the game, other characters start to openly question the book, even the main character himself, going as far as to realize that this is just La La Land and it's not actually possible. And if anything, the game refuses to pick a side until the very end of the game, which I'll talk more about in the last section. But even then, it's really hard to go as far as to call anything propaganda with how little it actually has to say about it. And I'd argue it just comes off as pretentious as fuck, if nothing else, because it's like, why are you trying to sit here and bash all these fucking ideologies when you yourself clearly don't have any better ideas outside of a fucking utopia that's fucking impossible to attain due to basic human nature? It's like, do you not think that the majority of people who have become nationwide leaders want the best for their people, or that they ultimately wish for some sort of utopia like this? But guess what? It hasn't happened yet because it's not fucking possible. And I'd go as far as to say that this leads to another problem with the central plot of the game, because for a game all about becoming king, your character has no plan once he becomes king. Seriously, you spend the whole game talking about becoming king, but your character the entire game basically goes, I guess I'll figure it out as I go. I guess I'll figure it out once I'm king. He has no plans. He just reads this stupid fucking utopia book and is like, yes, I am going to make a kingdom free of racism, everyone's equal, money won't be a problem, which causes me to refuse to take the ending of this game seriously and leads straight into our last section, the spoiler section, because there are at least 2 or 3 parts of this story that I want to talk more about. So the first spoiler section I want to talk about actually happens kind of fairly early into the story, but for the first part of the tournament, every contestant is tasked with bringing in the head of a monster. And one of our party members, Stroll, has the idea, which I personally also agreed was a pretty good idea, to help us stand out from the crowd. Instead of bringing in the head of an actual monster, we would instead bring the head of an actual human monster, after getting word of a local child kidnapper in a nearby town. After going to the town to find the kidnapper and one thing leads to another, we found out that Heisme has been framed for the crime and hasn't actually kidnapped anybody, which eventually leads to him joining our party. And we eventually find out that the real kidnapper is actually the leader of the village named Joanna. And you eventually find out that Joanna's child was actually murdered in cold blood, and because of this it drove her to mass grief. And to help cope with her grief, she decided to harbor a human, a giant, disgusting fucking monster in her basement and feed innocent children and other townspeople to this monster because it reminded her of her child. And after defeating her and talking a little bit of sense into her, she agrees to offer her own head up to help you guys win the contest and to atone for her crimes. And after she says this, our party has the fucking balls to say shit like, oh, I don't even know if I want to turn you in anymore, or I don't know if this is a good idea. Are you fucking kidding me? She was killing innocent kids and feeding them to a goddamn monster. While don't get me wrong, I do feel bad for her, and I especially feel bad for her innocent child. That is not an excuse to commit such horrible fucking crimes. That's like if you were walking by and you saw a dude slamming babies against a brick wall, and when you walked up to him, you're like, yo man, what are you doing? What's wrong with you? And he goes, oh, my son was recently murdered and I'm in deep grief. It's like, okay man, like I feel bad for you, that's horrible, but you can't be fucking killing innocent kids. And once she does turn herself in and she's swiftly killed to pay for her horrible crimes, our party is probably the only group of people there talking about how horrible this is and how they don't know if that was the right course of actions. And I'm sorry, but that is fucking retarded. You are all a bunch of fucking retards. That's what I was sitting there saying after hearing the party say shit like that. You guys are lucky this is an actual medieval times, or each of the guards probably would have taken turns raping her, tied her upside down to a tree, and then beat her to death with clubs. It's a great example of what I mean when I say that of how black and white the writing in this game is. It's either you're the nicest person on planet Earth or you're pure fucking evil. There can be no nuance or gray areas in between. And while that didn't ruin the game for me that early, it definitely took me out of it. The second spoiler moment is actually the halfway point in the story that I mentioned before, and it's the part in the story where you get to the point of actually trying to assassinate Luis. And this whole part of the story is basically called the Opera House incident. And honestly, it sucks because I was really enjoying this part of the story and the tension was built pretty well up until the part where you get to the actual assassination, and arguably one of the worst Deus Ex Machina moments happens in the entire story. But let's just say that you stab Luis not just once, but twice, with a giant spear that is over 6 inches in width, with one of those stabs going directly through his spine, where he then proceeds to fall 8 stories, landing on a hardwood floor, obviously being dead as fuck, where then the very next in-game day, he comes back from the dead after being revived by another character that was presumed dead towards the beginning of the story after he jumped the distance of 3 twin towers stacked on top of each other like a Chinese sweatshop worker. And this is also the point in the story where the entire plot begins to fall apart, in my opinion, because moments like this begin to become the norm. Which leads me in with my other main 2 spoiler moments, both involving the ending of the game. And this is also the part in the story where Luis throws away absolutely any and all nuance as a well-written villain to become your typical JRPG in the world type guy. And it also highlights just how fucking stupid Luis's plan was the entire game. But what essentially happens, without going into too many details, is that Luis tries to harness the power of the king using his scepter, and what he plans to do is turn everybody into a human, one of those giant monsters, by manifesting their anxieties. And by doing this, he thinks that only the strong will remain after they overcome the transformation. And just to put this into perspective for you, our main character, who has already beaten Luis twice by this point, was barely able to overcome the transformation himself, even having the power of an archetype, which is a magic that no one else has had access to in like 1,000 years. So realistically, probably only about 1% of the population would actually be able to overcome this transformation. So Luis's plan is pretty much just to end the entire world, because even if those few strong people do remain, they'll now be living in a hellscape overrun by giant fucking beasts that want to kill them every second of every day. Not just did I find the whole concept and metaphor, people becoming monsters due to their anxieties, to be fairly fucking cringe and in your face as fuck, but this entire ending just felt some pulled out your ass type bullshit. And then the final spoiler is actually right after you defeat Luis and your character eventually becomes king. Like I mentioned earlier, this is where it comes full circle that your character has no fucking plan whatsoever, because once he becomes king, what he decides to do is invoke self-governing, and then he fucks off to go explore the world. And I found this hilarious because he invoked self-governing on a group of people that less than a month ago were more racist than pre-civil right America, treating each other worse than the Japanese treated the Chinese on a daily basis, to now run everything on their own. Yeah, I'm sure this will have no repercussions. I'm 100% sure that the main character won't come back a few months from now to see everything on fire, riots in the street, people being hanged, and mass rape at an all-time high. What a fucking joke of an ending. And this leads me straight into the final rating for the game. And this is also where I want to make something pretty clear, and that's that I did not hate this game. I felt like, if anything, I feel like it's simply too long for its own good, has a bit too much padding towards the end of the game, with a serviceable story. The main reason I wanted to go in so hard on the story and highlight my faults with it is because, like I said before, I do not understand the bizarre fucking praise that this game is getting. And I guess it's just because at this point, Atlas fans are used to eating diarrhea and juvenile writing. But at the end of the day, I still think it's a bit of a better game than Final Fantasy 16, and I didn't really enjoy it less than I enjoyed the Dragon Quest III remake. And that's why for my final rating, I'm gonna give it a 7 out of 10. And I'm not gonna lie, the ending of the game almost brought it down to a 6, But given that this was like a 100-hour long game, I'm not gonna let like a tenth of the entire plot drag it down by that much, especially since, like I said, I do still think it's better than Final Fantasy 16, despite also being a longer game in general. So in regards to what I recommend it, I would say if you want to play an RPG that you haven't played before, or maybe you really enjoy the Shin Megami Tensei combat, or the Persona calendar system, then I'd recommend you probably pick it up on sale. I wouldn't pay $70 for it like I did. And I hope that at some point, gamers in general start having a higher standard for writing. If you enjoyed the review, leave a like and a sub. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.